The receptionist barely looked up when she walked in. Just a glance, a clipped nod, and a hand wave toward the waiting area like she was redirecting a delivery driver. The woman, dressed in a navy cardigan and well-worn flats, walked with soft steps and a worn leather briefcase tucked under her arm. Her gray-streaked hair was tied back in a no-nonsense bun. No jewelry, no brand-name shoes, no makeup. Not the sort of woman who looked like she belonged in a modern tech firm's glassy downtown office. But she was there, quietly, for an interview. The position was for a project management lead at Everon Dynamics, a mid-sized software solutions company that had just gone through a bold rebranding and was full of open-concept workspaces, kombucha taps, and executives with LinkedIn taglines that included words like disruptor, visionary, and growth hacker. Margaret Hale had none of those. She sat for 10 minutes without being acknowledged. A few younger employees passed her by, glanced once, and resumed their conversations about sprint cycles and data onboarding. One even commented, not quite under his breath, she must be here to temp or something. Margaret said nothing. When she was finally called in, the interview room was already half full. A panel of 3, all in their late 30s, all sleekly dressed in business casual that cost more than her entire outfit. One of them, a man named Brent, offered a hand with the kind of smile reserved for toddlers and elderly relatives. "Margaret, right?" he said brightly. "Thanks for coming in today." She shook his hand firmly, looked each interviewer in the eye, and waited for them to begin. The questions came quickly, but not with curiosity, with condescension wrapped in politeness. One woman, Lauren, asked, "Your resume says you've had some independent consulting roles over the past few years. Can you clarify that?" Margaret replied evenly, "Yes. I've worked on data operations efficiency with several firms in the financial and health sectors. Mostly confidential engagements." Brent raised an eyebrow. "Do you have metrics? Clients we can verify?" "They prefer discretion," she said. "But I'm happy to provide sanitized case summaries." They exchanged a glance, the kind that says, "She's not going to give us the names we want." Lauren frowned slightly. "Some of the formatting on your resume feels a bit dated. Have you had help with any professional career services lately?" "No," Margaret replied. "I wrote it myself." Brent chuckled, not kindly. "Right. Well, it's refreshing." Then came the harder questions, phrased in that passive-aggressive corporate tone people use when they think they're being clever. "Would you say you're comfortable in fast-paced, agile environments? Or do you prefer more structured legacy systems?" "I've worked in both," she replied. "My focus is on scalable process regardless of culture. The speed should serve the purpose, not become the purpose." Silence. They didn't like that. Too thoughtful. Too measured. Not enough buzzwords. Then Lauren leaned forward and asked, "And what attracted you to Everon Dynamics?" Margaret smiled gently. "Your recent pivot. You're transitioning from logistics modeling into predictive sales forecasting. That kind of shift requires back-end cleanup, cultural reskilling, and restructured sprint pipelines. You'll need someone who understands both the technical demands and the psychological impact of that change." Brent shifted in his seat. "Well, sure, but that's more of a C-suite conversation. Not if you want your teams to survive it," she replied without blinking. And that's when they decided they wouldn't hire her. Not because she lacked experience, but because she made them feel small without ever raising her voice. Her calm unraveled their polish. Her steadiness exposed their performance. They wrapped the interview early. Lauren stood and said, "Thank you for coming in. We'll be in touch by next week." Margaret nodded, shook their hands again, even as she saw the smirk flicker on Brent's lips, and walked out with the same quiet grace she had entered with. The receptionist didn't look up this time. In the elevator, a young man in a hoodie asked her, "Lost your way, ma'am?" "No," she said softly. "Just finished an interview." He gave her a sympathetic look. "Good luck." She smiled. "Thank you." She walked out of the building into the sunlight and kept walking past the rows of electric scooters, the sleek glass storefronts, and the cafe where she'd once advised a startup to pull their product from market 2 weeks before their Series B round collapsed. She knew this city. She had walked these blocks years ago when no one was paying attention. And now, the ones who thought they owned the future didn't even recognize her as part of its foundation. She got into a rust-colored Volvo. It had a cracked dashboard and a stack of Moleskine notebooks in the passenger seat. She didn't cry. She didn't vent on social media. She just drove back to the cottage she rented 3 miles outside the city, made herself a cup of ginger tea, opened her laptop, and pulled up a folder labeled Targets, Underperforming Mid-Market Firms. At the top of the list, Everon Dynamics. Revenue stable. Burn rate rising. Culture churn high. 3 key executives with shallow equity and high leverage on options. A perfect candidate. She clicked on the profile. Made a note. Low resilience under pressure. Fragile leadership culture. Ideal for silent reposition. 2 months later, she would walk back into that same building, not in flats and a cardigan, but in the position of principal buyer, holding the keys to every door they thought belonged to them. But for now? Now she watched the sun set and whispered to herself, "They never saw me coming, and they still won't until it's already done." Margaret Hale sat at her kitchen table, tea cooling beside her, eyes flicking between 3 browser tabs and 2 spreadsheets. On one tab, Everon Dynamics' most recent investor call transcript. On another, a breakdown of their product pipeline delays. The third was their executive equity distribution chart, publicly filed, rarely scrutinized, but Margaret read it like a chessboard. Brent, the smug panelist from the interview, held just under 2% invested shares, and Lauren had 1.4%, likely tied to a 3-year cliff with limited liquidity. The real weight sat with 2 early-stage angel investors, both of whom were aging out of the board and had signaled interest in offloading to diversify their portfolios. That mattered. Quiet signals mattered. Margaret had built an entire career around reading the soft parts of systems, the pauses, the phrases between the lines, the power structures that functioned just out of view. She wasn't angry. Margaret had stopped reacting to condescension decades ago. She didn't feel pain from people like Brent or Lauren. She felt prediction. Their faces, their tone, their assumptions were familiar patterns. They were exactly the kind of people she used to hire, develop, and, when necessary, remove. Years ago, she had co-founded a company called Dovetail Analytics. Back then, she'd been a single mother with a laptop, a degree from a no-name college, and a knack for spotting inefficiencies in small-scale logistics. Her first algorithm helped a chain of bakeries reduce waste by 42%. Her second saved a rural hospital network millions in medication tracking. By the time Dovetail was acquired, she held 34% ownership and declined the spotlight. Her co-founder took the stage. Margaret took the check. She stayed on the board for 18 months, then sold her remaining shares in a private deal and disappeared from headlines. She bought a small home with enough land to grow heirloom tomatoes, kept her old Volvo, and redirected her energy toward investing quietly in undervalued, mismanaged mid-market firms, particularly those run by people who underestimated quiet competence. She didn't dress the part of a venture capitalist. She didn't tweet about female empowerment or take panels on inclusion. She did the work, and the money followed. Her strategy was simple: find companies with brittle egos at the top, resilient teams at the bottom, and a path to value through cultural overhaul. Everon Dynamics fit that profile perfectly. Their tech was decent, their team talented, but the leadership was leaking substance in favor of branding. Too many team culture posts, not enough product movement. They were drowning in their own buzzwords and didn't even see the undertow pulling them out. Margaret already knew how it would unfold. Step 1 was engagement, quiet, under the radar. She reached out to the 2 earliest investors, posing as a partner from a family office. She didn't use her real name at first, just initials and a confidential inquiry. The first reply came 2 days later. Curious, cautious, but open. The second came 3 days after that. Both confirmed what she suspected. There had been internal talks about leadership fatigue and directional drift. Neither of them had strong attachments to the brand. They wanted liquidity, not a fight. Margaret offered terms. Nothing flashy. Clean, clear, and without fanfare. They agreed. And just like that, she had enough leverage to request access to Everon's deeper financials under the guise of acquisition due diligence. Through a legal proxy, she received internal reports, hiring patterns, product cycle maps, and, more importantly, exit strategy outlines. She reviewed everything. She learned that Brent's team had missed 3 critical deadlines on a flagship module that was now costing $190,000 a month in development overages. She saw Lauren's name appear on a staff complaint, quietly sealed after a junior developer flagged her for inappropriate credit misattribution. She read a culture survey from the product team that described the leadership as brilliant at marketing, mediocre at listening, and allergic to humility. It was all she needed. Margaret didn't call them. She didn't announce her presence. She kept filing through the numbers, pulling threads, watching the unravel happen from the inside. And while she did, she began building the scaffolding of the takeover, not hostile, not loud, just inevitable. She contacted 3 former Everon employees listed in exit interviews as high potential but underleveraged. She asked questions, listened, took notes. One of them now worked for a competitor. The other 2 were freelancing and unhappy about it. She asked them one thing. If the company changed hands, would you go back under better leadership? Both said yes. She added their names to her internal operations plan. Not for revenge, for repair. Meanwhile, through her holding firm, she initiated a shell acquisition process. The proposal was sent not to the board, but directly to the investors who mattered. Those with voting shares, those tired of being patient with Brent and Lauren and the bloated leadership overhead that did more posting than producing. By week 3 of the process, she owned 38% of the company through her network. Quietly, legally, strategically. That was the tipping point. She requested a meeting, an official one. No longer a job candidate. No longer a whisper in their inbox. She wanted to address the board. They didn't know it was her. Not yet. The meeting was scheduled in a glass conference room with a view of the city. The same room she had been dismissed from 2 months earlier. Margaret arrived 5 minutes early. This time in a tailored dark blazer, pressed slacks, and a leather portfolio under her arm. Same calm eyes. Same unshakable quiet. Brent walked in first. He didn't recognize her. Lauren followed. She did a double take, then blinked like she'd seen a ghost. Margaret stood and extended her hand. Good to see you both again. Brent tilted his head, confused. I'm sorry. Have we met? Yes, she said, shaking his hand. I interviewed here. 2 months ago. Silence. I believe your exact words were, we'll be in touch. Lauren's mouth went dry. Margaret sat down, opened her portfolio, and laid out the acquisition documents. I'm here now, she said, because I believe Everon still has value. Just not in its current leadership structure. Brent's face changed. Shock. Then disbelief. Then something Margaret recognized instantly. Fear. She didn't gloat. She didn't mock. She let the papers speak. Let the percentages speak. Let the signatures from their investors speak louder than any apology they would never muster. The room grew heavy. And Margaret Hale, the simple woman they had laughed out of a job interview, sat at the head of the table, not to be hired, but to hire. And this time, she would decide who belonged. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The papers she placed on the polished glass table were precise, notarized, and already signed. What she offered wasn't a proposal. It was a conclusion, a ledger of inevitability. And the silence in the room wasn't out of confusion. It was the stillness that comes when people realize they are no longer in control. Brent leaned back in his chair with the kind of stiff posture men use when they're trying to recover authority. He glanced down at the acquisition documents and then back up at her face, searching for some weak spot, some detail that would make this not real. This isn't possible, he said flatly. It's already done, Margaret replied. You'll find confirmation from your 2 largest voting shareholders. They've agreed to the buyout through my holding firm. And as of this morning, the change of controlling interest has been filed with the state. Lauren said nothing. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't look angry. She looked exposed. Margaret continued, her voice as even as paper on a quiet desk. This isn't a hostile takeover. I'm not here to humiliate anyone, but I am here to correct what's broken. Everon Dynamics has value. Its people have value. But your leadership style has extracted more than it has built. She paused and looked directly at Brent. I applied to this company not to test you, but because I genuinely wanted to contribute. What I received in return was a lecture on resume formatting and a room full of people who judged me before I opened my mouth. Brent's lips tightened. We're entitled to vet our candidates. Yes, she said, but you weren't vetting. You were dismissing. She stood, walked to the edge of the whiteboard, and picked up a marker. Without hesitation, she wrote 3 bullet points. High-value mid-level staff attrition rate, 42% over 2 years. Average dev cycle delay, 3.6 months. Investor confidence rating, downgraded 2 quarters in a row. I didn't learn this in the interview, she said. I learned it by listening to your people, by reading the notes they thought no one would read, and by reviewing the KPIs your executive summary omitted. Then she turned back to the table. This company didn't need a fresh pitch. It needed a mirror. Lauren finally spoke. So what happens now? Margaret sat down again. That depends on you. I'm offering a 6-month transitional contract to the existing leadership. Reduced scope, no strategic control, but generous severance at the end if you choose not to stay. You'll act as advisors while the internal reorg takes place. Brent shook his head. You can't just erase the years we've built here. I'm not erasing anything, she said. I'm protecting what's left. There was a long silence. Then Margaret added, and make no mistake, this isn't revenge. This is correction. Because for every person like me you laughed out of the room, there were 10 others who never even walked in because they knew they'd be treated like background noise. Brent stood. You won't last here. Margaret met his eyes, calm as ever. I already have. He left the room without shaking her hand. Lauren followed moments later. Margaret remained. Alone at the table, she looked around the boardroom. The cityscape shimmered behind the glass, the same view she'd seen when she was told she wasn't a cultural fit, that she lacked current methodologies, and that her resume was refreshing the corporate version of a pat on the head. But now, the only thing that sat between her and the skyline was opportunity. She pressed the intercom button on the desk. Can you send in the department heads, please? They entered slowly. Engineering, product, ops, marketing. A few familiar faces, some who'd passed her in the lobby 2 months earlier without a glance. This time, they sat up straight. Thank you for coming, Margaret said. I'm Margaret Hale. As of this morning, I'm the new owner of Everon Dynamics. I won't take much of your time, but I want to say one thing up front. No one here is being fired today. Shoulders eased. Eyes blinked. A silence of surprise. What we're going to do, she continued, is assess every process, every person, and every assumption that's been running this place. And we're going to fix what's been ignored. She picked up a stack of file folders from her leather bag and began passing them around. These are not pink slips. They're anonymized culture reports. Complaints. Concerns. Ideas. All gathered internally over the last year. A junior team lead opened his folder and gasped softly. This is my report. I read it, Margaret said. So did my operations team. And it matters. She looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes. Not with challenge, but with clarity. I'm not here to impress investors or trend on LinkedIn. I'm here to build a place that smart people don't want to leave. And that starts by showing them they matter, no matter how they dress, where they came from, or how long they've been overlooked. Someone clapped. Then another. Then silence again, because they weren't sure if applause was appropriate. Margaret smiled gently. Go back to your teams. Let them know change is here. Not because someone new is at the top, but because someone real is in the room. They filed out. She remained, reviewing notes, sketching her first 30-day plan. By the end of the day, HR reported that staff inquiries had spiked, not out of fear, but curiosity. Employees wanted to know who she was, where she came from, and how long she'd be staying. A few even asked how they could help. By Friday, she'd removed 3 bloated managerial layers and reinstated a rotation program for high-performing junior staff. By Monday, the old innovation wall in the break room, a board filled with meaningless slogans, was replaced by a transparency tracker, a living dashboard showing salaries by level, promotion rates, and department feedback cycles. She called it the mirror. And above it, she hung a plaque. This company was nearly lost because no one listened. That ends now. MH. In a back office, Brent packed his things. He didn't take the buyout. He just left. Lauren stayed for 3 more weeks, offering occasional insights but speaking less and less each day. When she exited, she left behind a note. Not to apologize. Just a single sentence scrawled across the back of her last company badge. I underestimated the quiet. Margaret kept it, because it was the first honest thing Lauren had ever said. They said nothing when she passed them in the hallway. Some lowered their eyes. Some gave stiff nods. A few, the smarter ones, watched closely, not out of fear, but with the cautious interest of people seeing something unfamiliar and quietly powerful. Margaret Hale didn't need to prove herself with speeches or startup platitudes. She was already proving herself with presence. Her office wasn't on the top floor, not in the corner. She'd taken the smaller room down the hall from the operations bullpen. Glass on only one side. One desk. No art. Just a clean wall where she hung a framed easement document, a nod to the first company she'd ever bought land for, quietly saving a tech incubator from a zoning disaster 15 years earlier. No one understood its meaning, but that was fine. The people who needed to understand eventually would. The transition was swift and structured. She didn't come in with swinging axes. No mass firings. No ego. Just quiet correction. One department at a time, one policy at a time. Her philosophy was simple. Fix the leak before it floods. And Everon had been leaking from the ceilings, floors, and every crack in between. Her first change was in the engineering team. The CTO, who had grown comfortable in committee meetings and demo calls, had slowly become a bottleneck rather than a leader. Margaret didn't remove him publicly. She reallocated his role, putting 3 mid-level team leads into rotational director seats with shared decision authority. Within 2 weeks, productivity doubled and the backlog dropped by nearly 30%. The old CTO resigned voluntarily. She sent him a handwritten note. "Thank you for your time. You built something worth preserving. I'm here to help it grow." He never expected that. Neither did anyone else. Next came product strategy. Margaret uncovered 2 overlapping initiatives that had burned $800,000 in duplicated design over 18 months. One had been greenlit by Brent, the other by a manager trying to impress him. Margaret brought the teams into a single room, laid the 2 reports side by side, and said simply, "Tell me what matters. We don't ship complexity. We ship solutions." A woman named Divya, a mid-level analyst who had once been ignored in meetings, stepped forward and outlined a hybrid model in under 10 minutes. Margaret approved it on the spot. "Get her what she needs," she said, and just like that, a forgotten voice became a respected architect of the company's next product launch. It didn't take long before her name began circulating, not in whispers, but in admiration. Not because she forced it, because she earned it. In meetings, she spoke last and briefly. In memos, she used bullet points and never added her name in bold. She walked the halls at 7 a.m. with a coffee mug from a diner that had long since closed down and remembered every person's name who'd ever told her the truth about how things worked around here. And as the old culture faded, the new one took root. The once glossy motivational posters disappeared. In their place, whiteboards filled with questions, not directives. One day, someone wrote in the middle of the central board, "What does respect look like in a team?" By the afternoon, 50 answers were scribbled underneath in every color of dry erase marker. Margaret saw it at 6 p.m. when the office was nearly empty. She added her own. "It looks like listening before fixing." No signature. Everyone knew who wrote it anyway. Not everything changed easily. There were holdouts, people used to perks over progress, who grumbled when the weekly wine cart was replaced by a rotating speaker series of employees sharing how they'd solved real problems. But the grumblers didn't last. Not because they were forced out, because they couldn't keep up with the honesty in the air. Margaret held her first company-wide Q&A 3 weeks after finalizing the buyout. She stood in front of 200 chairs in the old auditorium. She wore no blazer, no heels, just a navy sweater, dark jeans, and the kind of posture that said she was unshakable but not unkind. She began with a story, not a pitch. She told them about the interview, the one that started it all. She didn't name names. Didn't shame anyone. She told it with clarity, not bitterness. "I was asked whether I understood modern business models," she said. "I wasn't insulted. I was informed. Informed that this company had a listening problem, that it couldn't recognize talent if it didn't come wrapped in keywords and brand names." She paused. "I decided to fix that." And then she told them what came next, how she'd seen the value under the surface, how she'd bought her way back not to win, but to repair. "But I'm not the hero of the story," she added. "You are, if you choose to be. If you build a company that sees people first, listens first, and never needs a wake-up call like I was." Someone stood and clapped. Then another. Soon the room was filled with applause. Not wild. Not orchestrated. Earnest. Afterward, people lined up, not for handshakes, but to say things they'd never said before. Stories of ideas killed in meetings. Promotions passed over. Confidence eroded by constant judgment. Margaret listened to each one. She remembered every name. In the following weeks, 3 quiet policies went into effect. No resume blind screening. All applications would be reviewed anonymously, graded on capability, not branding. Team-led evaluations. Peer feedback now counted more than single manager reviews. Reverse interviews. Final stage candidates would interview the hiring team before accepting any role, with full transparency. Hiring improved. Retention soared. But more importantly, the feeling in the office changed. People walked taller. The coffee line buzzed with real conversation instead of posturing. And once, someone wrote in chalk on the lobby floor. She bought the company that rejected her, but she didn't buy revenge. She bought redemption. Margaret saw it on her way in that morning. She didn't erase it. She walked over it, stepped into her office, and opened her laptop to a new tab, Emerging Startups, Cultural Risks. Because now that Everon was steady, she was ready to do it again. Not out of spite, out of promise. Because the world was full of companies that didn't know what they were missing, until someone quiet walked in and bought the whole thing. The winter that year was mild, the kind that left a soft chill in the mornings but gave way to sunlight by afternoon. From her office window, Margaret could see the first green shoots returning to the rooftop garden Everon's founders had built years ago for aesthetics and Instagram appeal, then let wither after the third quarter earnings dip. She'd had it replanted with native wildflowers and added benches made by a local carpenter. Now, it was quiet up there, but alive, just like the company. 3 months had passed since the buyout, and everything had changed. Not the logo, not the tech stack, the soul. Margaret walked through the building the same way she always had. Unhurried, intentional, invisible only to those who weren't paying attention. But now, almost everyone was paying attention. She didn't carry a tablet. She carried a notebook. She didn't host strategy lunches. She sat in on team stand-ups. The open floor plan that once felt cold and performative had found new rhythm. Conversations weren't curated. They were collaborative. Ideas weren't hoarded. They were handed over, improved, built upon. The woman who had once been laughed out of a job interview had rewritten the rules without ever having to raise her voice. One morning in April, Margaret received an unexpected email from a name she hadn't heard since her acquisition was finalized. Lauren. It was short. Margaret. I've been thinking a lot about that day. The interview. I didn't know what I was looking at, and I'm not proud of that. If you're willing, I'd like to talk. Lauren. Margaret thought about it for a long moment. She replied, tomorrow, 11 a.m. Rooftop garden. When Lauren arrived, she looked different. Not dressed down, but dressed real. Not a curated power outfit, but something comfortable. Her eyes carried less defense and more searching. Margaret was already seated on a bench, sipping from a thermos. Lauren sat beside her in silence for nearly a full minute before speaking. I thought I knew what leadership looked like. Margaret said nothing. I thought it came in a certain package. A way of speaking. A kind of resume. I've been doing some work on myself, she added, almost self-consciously. Trying to unlearn some things. That's a good start, Margaret said. Lauren nodded. I used to think being underestimated was the worst thing that could happen to a woman in this industry. Margaret turned to her. It's not. No. It's being underused. Lauren exhaled. I guess you're proof of that. Margaret gave the faintest smile. You're not the first to overlook me. You won't be the last. But what matters now is what you do with the part of you that recognized it afterward. Lauren sat quietly, taking it in. When she stood to leave, she looked Margaret in the eye and said, Thank you for not becoming like us. Margaret shook her hand and said simply, That was the point. That spring, Everon did something no one expected. They launched an apprenticeship program, not just for recent grads, but for women over 40 returning to the workforce, for veterans shifting careers, for mothers who'd paused, and for people who didn't have traditional credentials but had built real solutions in the quiet of their own worlds. It wasn't performative. It was personal. The program was called The Rewrite. And on its landing page, right below the mission statement, was a single line. We missed someone once. We don't plan to again. Applicants poured in from across the country. Women who had stepped away for caregiving. Men who'd been let go because they couldn't keep up with change. Coders who had once freelanced in silence while the spotlight hit louder voices. They came not for charity, but for recognition. For a seat they were never offered but always deserved. Internally, Everon's own junior employees helped design the training modules. Margaret asked them why they wanted to do it. One answered, because someone made room for my voice. I want to make room for theirs. At the next town hall, Margaret addressed the company again. She didn't bring slides. She didn't bring notes. She brought a box. She set it on the table and opened it. Inside were 23 old resumes, each one printed on the same plain paper she'd used the day she first interviewed. They were fake, fictional applications she had written using the stories of real people who had told her they'd been overlooked. She held up one. This one was from a woman who raised 4 kids, cared for 2 aging parents, and still managed to teach herself 3 coding languages in her garage. She held up another. This one, a refugee who ran an underground tech support service in a war zone with a laptop, a satellite modem, and 5 solar batteries. More. This one, a 60-year-old veteran who taught database logic to community college students and was told he didn't fit the culture at his last interview. She looked at the crowd. These people applied to jobs and were passed over because they didn't look the part. didn't sound like the polished ideal. I wrote these so we never forget what we might be missing. Everon doesn't hire for polish anymore. We hire for depth. She let the silence settle. And then she said, "You're not here because you said the right things. You're here because you've done the right things. Remember that. And protect it for those who come next." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was grounded, earnest. The kind of sound people make when they know they're not clapping for a show, they're clapping for a shift. In June, a business magazine published an article titled, "The Quiet Takeover That Fixed Everything." Margaret didn't give interviews. She didn't pose for photos. She issued one quote. "They laughed when I walked in. I didn't walk back to laugh. I walked back to build." And that was the last the press heard from her. She spent most days in her office or walking with junior staffers in the courtyard, taking notes, nodding, asking hard questions with soft tone. On the anniversary of her acquisition, the company left a note taped to her office door. "You made room. You changed the rules. You rewrote the ending. Thank you for walking back in." She took it down, folded it, and placed it inside her notebook beside the one item she had never removed since the beginning of this journey. A single paperclip from the resume that they once mocked as dated. Because that resume? It got the last word. And Margaret Hale? She got the whole company.